what we advocate for is get rid of that binary discussion of submersion on the one hand of traditional bilingual education programs and go for what we call a more functional plurilingual learning approach, which is very close to a translanguaging reality, trying to transfer that, translate that into a pedagogy. So it is about exploiting. How can I, as a teacher, exploit the plurilingual repertoires as a didactical capital for learning? So the functional use of the home languages in multilingual, L2 dominant learning environments. So not the L2 proficiency, but the performance of language repertoires is central in that idea. So we are talking about what I call powerful learning environments, being able to create powerful multilingual learning environments. So where a multilingual social interaction model for learning is taken as a point of departure, as an alternative for a language learning model. What are the motivations? There's the social context, as I already said, super diverse localities, neighborhoods that have become extremely diverse, including schools and classrooms. There is the practical argument and there are the theoretical arguments, as I already said, which I think must need us to reflect on the rather traditional paradigms of language learning and teaching. There are two very important conditions. That's what we observed in the research project, but this is also supported by international research. One is that a functional plurilingual learning approach can only be effective when it is structurally embedded in a school policy that opts for a multilingual perspective. I've seen schools where teachers want to exploit the multilingual repertoires of the kids in the classroom, but when that's not, when he or she is the only person who believes in the importance of exploiting the repertoires as a resource of these kids, then he often is well, not in a fight, but in discussions, major discussions. He is not supported by a principal, not supported by a team in doing that. And as I also said and mentioned, the importance of creating powerful learning environments is also a fundamental condition. Let me give you one example, as I said, of a project we did. It was funded, it was a longitudinal study, 2008 to 2012, funded by the city of Ghent. It was called Home Language and Education Project. Interesting thing was that when in 2008 the Alderman for Education announced that project of functional plurilingual learning and multilingual education, it was launched in the press through a press conference the day afterwards. He and the director of the education department of the city was summoned to come to Brussels to the Flemish Minister of Education, and he said, I don't want you to go on with that project. You can't even start that project. They discussed for about half a day. At the end of the discussion, he said, okay, go on, but I don't want to hear anything of it. Don't bring it in the press. But that was the minister who also said, yes, Mr. Van Avermaet, but when I have 100% time to teach these kids Dutch as a second language, and you take out of that 20%, I'm only left with 80. And I've been trying to explain in that language learning and language acquisition is a bit more complex, but I failed, unfortunately. But anyway, the interesting thing was that the city of Ghent contested that idea and tried to reconstruct it, and they went on with the project. What were the aims? Trying to find an alternative for traditional L2 proficiency submersion, an alternative for traditional bilingual education programs and more exploiting, but at the same time, because one of the people within the education department of the city was very interested to find empirical evidence for within migration or immigrant contexts of commons interdependency theory. So, and part of the experiment was about first a rather traditional bilingual program, first learn to read and write these Turkish kids in Turkish as a step up towards L2. Right. What are the specific features of Flanders? An increasing linguistic diversity of urban schools, as I already mentioned several times, a persistent socio-ethnic segregation and inequality in urban school systems. Flanders is in PISA always in top 5, ranked top 5. But it also has the largest gap between low and high achievers of all countries or regions participating. There is the dominant language ideology is the official policy line. Dutch is the exclusive medium of instruction. The educational position of low status minorities is that there are a lot of restrictions, a very restrictive school policies. The L1s are not welcomed, often banned. One example is that children of grade 6, so last year of primary, they have during, how do you call it, playtime? Playtime, they have to walk around with a piece of paper and they have to write down the names of the children who speak another language. Or another example is that children who speak another language than Dutch, they get a sticker. Not a yellow sticker. So a complete denial of linguistic capital. A complete denial. Two major objectives: creating powerful learning environments, exploiting where the L1s of kids are exploited, and academic literacy development in L1. I will mainly focus on objective A, but will also briefly give you some results of objective B. As I said, longitudinal study, 2 cohorts of learners. We started with a cohort in K2 and K3, and we went on to G2 and G3. About 350, 360 participants, of which there were 4 experiment schools, 6 comparison schools, so we had about 190 focus group students, and it was a multi-method design. It was quantitative and qualitative. It was a traditional pre-post test and control group design, but we also, through interviews and questionnaires and observations, we also intensively looked at the processes that went on in the schools. What was the baseline study in 2008? As we had expected, a dominant monolingual L2 submersion model. In all 4 of the experiment schools, there was a banning of the L1. In one of the schools that was the most strict, there were even, how do you call that, canvas?
Notice board.
No, not on the playground. So
a banner.
Banners, yeah. Huge banners, which says on the playground we speak only Dutch. That kind of thing. So in one of these 4 schools, so there was a maximum L2 exposure, and multilingualism was seen as having no cognitive or linguistic surplus or whatsoever. Interesting thing was that because we started in kindergarten, we started to see some shift, even at the beginning of the project, some shift amongst kindergarten teachers, which was definitely not in primary schools. There was much more tolerance about spontaneous use of children's L1s within the classroom, and there was an emerging L1 related practice that were facilitated. Because they were convinced that facilitated children's well-being. Interesting is that this is not the only example where we see major differences between kindergarten on the one hand and all the rest of our educational systems. I always keep saying that from university up to primary education, 5 minutes, we can learn a lot about what's going on in kindergarten.